wherever you're located right now, but we're very glad that you took the time to join us tonight for this very, in my opinion, interesting and important lecture that we're going to listen to soon. You've already heard from Emilia a lot about what the SIB is about and what we are as an association. And as she said, we have plenty of events coming up this week. And after this lecture, we also have a interactive bingo. So if you have joined us for the lecture, feel very much free to stay for that one as well. And one of the very nice things about SIB is that we also have a lot of committees who can get involved by organizing several activities, from the travel that we do every year to several of our lectures. And tonight's lecture has actually been organized by the Activities Committee. So I would like to give the floor to Ellie, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. Also on behalf of the Activities Committee, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this lecture. And today I'm pleased to introduce to you Karlijn van Houwelingen, who is joining us from New York, where she has been working as a correspondent for the Algemeen Dagblad since 2015. And she will be talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in light of the recent events that sparked protests against white supremacy all over the world. And so without further ado, I'll give the floor to Karlijn van Houwelingen.
Thank you, Ellie. Can you all hear me? I hope I unmuted myself. This is always technically a little bit complicated, this setup, but it's actually perfect because I wouldn't be able to be in Groningen because of a lot of, travel restrictions. And, the pandemic doesn't make it easier to travel, so it's good to be here virtually from New York City, as Ellie said. And I'm going to share with you some impressions of the Black Lives Matter movement as I've covered the protest for AD, Algemeen Dagblad, which is one of the major newspapers in the Netherlands, if you're not familiar with it. And I'd like to start with a photo. I think you all see it in your screen. This is a photo that I took at the end of May. It was not even a week after the killing of George Floyd. As you probably know, that was the man whose death sparked this wave of protest in the US and around the world. And this is Adrian, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn. I met him in a neighborhood called Flatbush in Brooklyn, a predominantly Black neighborhood founded by Dutch colonists who called it like flat bush. That's why it's called like a flat woodland. That's why it's called Flatbush. And Adrian was at a protest where I was too. It was mostly pretty calm when we were there, but suddenly at some point when the sun went down, everything changed. There was an intimidating amount of police officers, I would say, a helicopter flying around. And here you see Adrian right after he got pepper sprayed by a police officer. We basically both ran away. There was a lot of chaos at that point because, you could feel the fear of people for tear gas, pepper spray, things that had been used in the past couple of days, also in other cities. So I also had to run a couple of times, and that's when in the back of the group, basically, I met Adrian. He just ran away, and there was a woman taking care of his eyes who rinsed his eyes to help him get rid of the feeling, the pain. She cleaned his wound a little bit. He fell when he was he was fleeing the police force. And she gave him her goggles, actually. He didn't have them, but here he just put them on, basically ready to go back to the protest. But right before that, he told me his story. And he basically kept repeating, "I'm so tired of this. I'm so tired of this. It's been enough. We're fighting back." And he was crying at partly because of the pepper spray, but also because of emotions. He was very frustrated, and you could feel the deep anger in him. And he told me what happened to him last year. And there's actually a video of what happened to him, and I'd like to try to share that video with you. It's not available in Europe, so I'm gonna try to share my screen with you guys. And well, we're gonna try to watch it. Just keep in mind that this whole dramatic moment in the New York subway that you're gonna see ended with Adrian being charged for not paying the subway fare. So that's a really minor offense. Let me try to share the screen. They show you an ad first.
3 months ago, there weren't enough masks. We were desperately sourcing from all over the world. People were making face coverings from scarves, bandanas, and bits of fabric. Now there are plenty of masks, but some people don't want to wear them. Come on. Mask up, America.
Sorry about that. This is so what you see there is a moment last year in the fall of 2019 when the police suspected Adrian of having a weapon. They were following him. He jumped in the subway, and the next stop there were well, you could see a ton of police officers waiting for him. He's sitting there alone in the subway car because all the people around him fled to the ends of the cart because they saw a bunch of police officers pointing their guns at him. And he told me how scared he was that, just like a lot of mostly Black Americans that he had seen in videos like this, not surviving encounters with the police that are similar to this one. He was like, if I would move a centimeter, they could shoot. That was his fear. Well, it ended with him being charged for not paying the subway ticket because he didn't have the gun that they were looking for. And Adrian basically ended up, well, I would say a bit traumatized from this experience, as I could see in his eyes when he recounted that to me at the protest in Flatbush. He knows that so many people die at the hands of the American police, and to be precise, that's about 1,100 people every year. It's all kinds of people, not only Black Americans, but Black Americans are definitely overrepresented in those numbers. And what's actually striking is that number of 1,100 people dying by police violence is pretty stable, which is pretty sad because you could say nothing changes. And I think that was the first reaction of a lot of people here after seeing that horrific video of the last minutes of the life of George Floyd. People would say, again, not again. We've seen this so many times before. There's been a lot of outrage in 2014 in Ferguson. You may have heard of that or may have seen that on the news back then. There was protest also because of the death of Michael Brown, another young Black man who didn't survive an encounter with the police. That got very ugly. after that, the highest stages of the entertainment world, the big names, the famous people, Beyonce, Kendrick Lamar, they all called for action, for attention, for this problem. And unfortunately, that didn't really make much difference, proved the video of the death of George Floyd. And when I talked to Adrian, the guy you saw in the photo and the video, it was striking to me to hear him say things that I heard before. I arrived in New York in the summer of 2015, exactly 5 years ago now. So that was after the protests in Ferguson in 2014, but there were some other things, some other incidents that I covered related to the same problem. I talked to people on Staten Island, for example, if I'm right, it was 2016, when a Black man in Dallas shot 5 police officers. It was seen as some kind of revenge for the death of 2 Black men who died that summer and whose deaths were filmed and all over social media. That summer I went to Staten Island, which is a part of New York here, where Eric Garner died. You may have heard his name because he passed away in a very similar way as George Floyd. He also said, "I can't breathe," right before he died in a police chokehold. And when I talked to the people at the corner, at the square where he used to hang out and where that happened, I found that a lot of those people were not surprised by the revenge that we had seen in Dallas in 2016 at that moment. And they would say, they kill us, nobody does anything, so they deserve this. Peaceful resistance is not getting us anywhere. And this is gonna explode at some point. There was a lot of understanding for the violence that was a reaction to police violence. So I'm telling you this basically to say this is in a way nothing new, what we've seen in recent months. In a lot of other ways, it is very new, so we'll get to that later, but this was brewing for a long time. And I think that's these tense race relations were one of the striking things for me coming from the Netherlands to be a correspondent in the US. I knew about the history of police violence, I knew about Ferguson, but in a way I would consider it something of the past, the blatant racism. There was a Black president at that time, so that would, it would basically, maybe cause that we would underestimate how strong the racial inequality still was in the United States. So that's something I figured out after moving here, which was actually, I would say, in a way, very disappointing. Hollywood and also politicians, it gives us this view of the United States as the greatest country in the world. So we don't have to prove that there's racism, as we can just hear. I wanted to get a little bit deeper into that. In the United States, we see the violence. There is a lot more. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of my reporting into the health effects of racism, for example. The amount of heart disease, the numbers when it comes to hypertension, diabetes, obesity, a lot more Black Americans suffer from these diseases. And I recently interviewed a professor who researched this extensively since the days of the civil rights movement. He, I think he's in his 80s or his 90s now. Professor Sherman James is his name. And he grew up in the South, which is the part, if you're not familiar with US history, which is the part of the US where I would say racism was traditionally the strongest because that was the part of the US where slavery was held on to for the longer time. And after that, there was a very oppressive system of rules and implicit rules that denied Black Americans a lot of opportunities, some kind of apartheid, you could call it. And Professor James noticed early on already that young Black men were dealing with heart disease and hypertension in rates way higher than what he saw in white communities, and they were also remarkably young. So he started to look into that and found a pattern, what he described to me as living your life as if you're running against a 100-mile-per-hour storm all the time. And other communities, white communities, just feel a slight breeze. And that basically running against the storm is the stress of having to deal with racism and oppression, discrimination, political oppression, economic discrimination. There is a physical effect of that. There's physical wear and tear. And that's one of the reasons that the coronavirus has been more deadly in Black communities in the United States. What I found in my reporting, I recently wrote a book that is mostly about sex and gender in the United States and the role of women in US society and US politics. I'll show you so you can. And I looked into the numbers for maternal mortality. That is shockingly high, that statistic. The US is in a short list of countries with Zimbabwe and North Korea, where in the last couple of years that number was still rising. And for Black moms, the numbers are even higher than for white moms. Black American moms have a 3 to 4 times higher chance of dying in childbirth. And that has to do with underlying health conditions, lack of access to good healthcare, to good healthy food, also with just not being taken seriously by doctors. In my book, I mentioned Serena Williams, who had to deal with that same issue when she gave birth to her daughter. The doctor was just not listening to her. When she was complaining about the pain on her chest, it turned out she had blood clots. And that happens a lot. There are some studies where lots of Black moms describe how they were just seen as rebellious and not someone to take seriously when they complain about symptoms. So health-wise, there is a big gap between white Americans and Black Americans. And there is another important field, so to say, and that's wealth. For me, it was pretty shocking that white families in the US on average are 10 times more wealthy than Black families. That's a big gap. And I think the saddest thing is that the gap is actually bigger now than in the 60s when the civil rights movement was at its height, when Martin Luther King fought for racial equality. It's a historic gap that has been growing over the centuries by forcing people to work at first and then denying them lots of opportunities. Also, the government had some official policies that just made it very, very hard for Black families to gain wealth, for example, by owning a home, which is a way for a lot of people of building their wealth. And Black neighborhoods were seen as high-risk neighborhoods. People couldn't get a mortgage, so a lot of Black families have not been able to build up that wealth. And certain things still exist. If you talk about denying Black people opportunities, there's still schools that are very much behind the schools in wealthy white neighborhoods. There are schools that are called Apartheid Schools because there's basically no white kids at the schools. Mass incarceration is a big problem in Black communities. Prison became part of life, I would say, in some Black communities. That is caused by the war on drugs. That was mostly fought in Black neighborhoods and not in white neighborhoods. So there were very large sentences for minor offenses, drug-related offenses, which, according to some estimates, it means by now that 1 in 3 Black males in the US spends time in prison in their lives. And it has been described, this whole system that is supposed to, create justice for people. It has been described by a famous author, Michelle Alexander is her name. She wrote a very good book about this. And she described the prison system as a new way to create second-class citizens in the US, to keep the Black communities in that position of second-class citizens. So there is a lot behind the police violence that also fuels the protests that we've seen. Because I think for a lot of people that I've met at those protests, this is not only about police violence, this is definitely the trigger, but it's definitely also about the broader inequality behind it. You could get very cynical. Nothing changed since the 1960s. There's still some legislation on the books, even though it's not as explicit as it used to be, that holds Black communities back in the United States. Voting requirements, for example, make it specifically for communities of color harder to vote in certain states. I talked to protesters who told me that they got advice from their grandparents who were part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And they told me, I'm fighting the same fight as my grandparents, it's basically very sad. There was also a lot of hope and optimism in these protests. So I don't just want to paint a picture of, well, nothing ever changed and this is how it is. Because I was struck by the amount of optimism that I saw. I was amazed by how many Americans came out to show their support and to make their voice heard. You can tell when you walk around in a big protest like that Americans have a lot of faith in their democratic system, even though it is, I would say, under attack nowadays. President Trump doesn't always care about this so sacred democratic system in the US. But lots and lots and lots of people, millions of people, believe that they can achieve change by making their voices heard in this way. I have a Kurdish friend who's a journalist in the US also, and he once told me this kind of inequality, this kind of violence, it would be a civil war in the Middle East. But in the US, it's protest, and it's mostly peaceful protest. There was definitely some less peaceful parts of it. We'll get to that. But overall, it's been an impressive movement, and it's estimated to be the largest protest movement in the US history. Pollsters try to count the amount of people that actually participated by doing opinion polls, and they get to a number of 15 to 26 million Americans who participated in recent months in one of these protests. I'd like to look a little bit at why this movement could be so strong now, because Black Lives Matter has been around since 2013. That's when it was first used as a hashtag in response to anger at the death of Trayvon Martin, another name that has been around the media and social media so many times as one of the victims of police violence in the US. But 7 years later, it got a whole new phase, I would say. The protests look very different than in the beginning of Black Lives Matter, because a lot more white Americans are joining them. If you walk around in these groups on the streets, you'll see that it's a very diverse crowd. Maybe even more white Americans than Black Americans in some protests that I've been at. It depends a little bit on the location. I think one of the reasons is the video of the death of George Floyd that was just very, very visible. What happened there, you hear his last words, you see the indifference of the police officers, that just struck a nerve, so to say. It came in the middle of a pandemic, which was or is a tense time in the United States. There is a lot of emotion, a lot of frustration about the response of the US government. Inequalities were even more visible than before. Plus, it was just practically possible to go to a protest because a lot of people were home. That, of course, also helped to get more people on the streets. And I would say that under President Trump, there is some kind of protest culture that has been growing since day one, basically. The first day after his inauguration, I was at the Women's March. It was a huge protest about women's rights. And since then, there have been a lot of marches, and people got used again to taking the street, to make signs, to make their voices heard. I've seen some polls where 1 in 5 of the respondents had been part of a protest since Trump got inaugurated. So that's about 20% of Americans who actually participate in these protests. And that's lots of millions of people. Then there's another thing. There's the Trump administration itself. It has been throwing gasoline on the fire, I would say. At these protests against police violence, there was a lot of police violence, which is a bit ironic, but also made very visible what the protest was actually about. And then we've seen the response of the president himself, who he showed very little effort to understand the complaints of all these people, to show empathy. For him, it was all about the violence that we've also seen at some protests, the looting and the rioting. He was threatening action, talking about the vicious dogs that he would send to protesters in Washington, D.C. He talked about radicals and criminals. And he even had a square in front of the White House cleared out with tear gas so he could walk to a church and hold the Bible. I was there the day after, and a lot of protesters told me that that was actually the reason they came. They had not been part of the protest before, but this response, this very aggressive response to what many people see as a legit protest, made more people angry. Not to say that there was no violence, because you may have seen the images on TV. Some of the protests were definitely hijacked by looters and rioters. And there is a tendency in the Black Lives Matter movement to not condemn that. The most dedicated activists, I would say, they look at that kind of violence the way Martin Luther King once described it. He said, a riot is the language of the unheard. Recently, this week in Chicago, we saw looting, very, very blatant looting in the city center, and some people who were arrested were actually supported by the local Black Lives Matter movement, and that's very, controversial, and that's also not something that everyone agrees with in the movement. I've talked to a lot of people who fear that their message is getting lost in the focus on the extremes and everything what's going wrong on the edges of their protest. Another part that's controversial is the call to defund or abolish the police. That's something that only 15% of Americans support, but there's some activists in the Black Lives Matter movement that most people who talk about it would say, no, it's not literally we want to reallocate some money from the police to social services, for example, because now there's something with mental illness. The police would deal with that, and we think it's better that a social worker be definitely a legitimate complaint. But there's some people who actually literally want to abolish the police, and well, that's not a very popular viewpoint. At the same time, it's also very hard to attack for people who are critical of Black Lives Matter, because there is no clear organization, there is no clear leader, there is no face of the movement. The Black women who started this in 2013 chose a very decentralized approach. So there is local chapters in different parts of the country. It's very loose because there is also protests that are kind of spontaneous. There's protests organized by people who are not officially part of anything. There's no official organization. There's just one person feeling that they want to make a statement, and that becomes a protest. So that makes it hard for mostly Americans on the conservative side who say they don't agree with this to attack Black Lives Matter. The phrase Black Lives Matter is not an organization. People use it as an expression of their values, and it doesn't mean they are a member of anything. Let's look quickly at the progress that has been made since George Floyd died and this wave of protest went through the US. Lots of young protesters that I've met, they are impatient and they feel that not enough is being done. Older Black Americans tend to focus a little more on how far we've come. And they would say if Barack Obama can be president, then anything is possible. But so far, we've only seen small steps. Small, but they are steps. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd died, the officers involved, for example, were fired really quickly and also put on trial, charged with murder. And that is very, very rare. That hasn't happened a lot in the past. There's a group, Mapping Police Violence is what they called. And they counted that only 1% of those cases in 2017 actually resulted in an officer being charged and going on trial. A lot of these officers keep their jobs, even. But on the local level, we definitely see some changes. Minneapolis decided to completely rebuild the police department. Here in New York, some money is reallocated, which is also, there's a lot of debate about it, but there is movement on that level. What is striking is that there's no action at all, or almost no action, at the federal level. Congress is not able to agree on anything, and also not able to agree on police reform. There was a bill in the House of Representatives that was a Democratic bill. It got stuck in the Senate, where the Republicans are the majority. And so far, they only came up with some kind of commission to study the problem, which is, of course, not very revolutionary. But at the same time, the pressure is on. You can definitely see that and feel that in the political world here. So the main question is, what is this all going to mean for the upcoming presidential election? November 3rd is the big day. Trump initially thought that he would focus on the economy as his main selling point. It was doing relatively well up until the pandemic and everything collapsed. So he had to find a new point that is central to his campaign. And that has become the Black Lives Matter movement. his reaction to the movement is all over his Twitter feed, I would say. He talks about law and order all the time. Like I said before, he focuses almost all the time on the criminal elements maybe that we've seen on the edges of these protests. So he focuses on the looting and the more radical parts. He and his allies try to paint Black Lives Matter as a Marxist movement now, because some important figures in the creation of Black Lives Matter have once said that they are aligned with Marxism, which doesn't apply to all those millions of other people who took the streets. But that's what I think Trump and his allies are trying to do, focus on the radical parts of the movement, and definitely connected to Joe Biden. They're basically stoking fear. In Biden's America, you won't be safe is the message, because the police department will be abolished. That's not something that Joe Biden actually supports. But yeah, the Trump campaign tries to connect him to the extreme elements of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's one campaign ad that illustrates that. We have a video. I think Nina can show it.
You have reached the 911 police emergency line. Due to defunding of the police department, we're sorry, but no one is here to take your call. If you're calling to report a rape, please press 1. To report a murder, press 2. To report a home invasion, press 3. For all other crimes, leave your name and number, and someone will get back to you. Our estimated wait time is currently 5 days. Goodbye.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Yeah, so this is pretty misleading, because Joe Biden has definitely been trying to align himself with the movement to embrace it, but he has also drawn a clear line that he's not supporting abolishing the police or even defunding the police. He actually wants more funds for the police to work on better policing. He has a very different approach to the movement, partly because Black Americans are the backbone of the Democratic Party. They are really, really important voters for him. They basically helped him become the presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. So Joe Biden, I would say, is hoping that all the energy from these protests will be a benefit for his campaign. He knows that Hillary Clinton in 2016 lost partly because of low turnout among Black voters. And he needs Black voters to come out and vote for him in big numbers. So he hopes that all these people taking the streets are also going to the polls. It's not clear if that will actually happen, because a lot of the activists in the Black Lives Matter movement are not particularly very happy with Joe Biden. He is a moderate Democrat who has a lot of baggage from his past. He was already a senator when I was not even born, so you can see how for years he made political decisions, and if you look at them with the eyes of today, they're not always the best decisions in the eyes, for example, of the Black Lives Matter activist, and mostly the most dedicated activist. He wrote part of a crime bill that has been very important, for example, contributed to mass incarceration. I think he's definitely trying to kind of accommodate the movement, but also not alienate the Americans who are in the middle and don't always feel comfortable with the more extreme elements of it. There is a lot of pressure on him to nominate a Black woman as his vice presidential candidate, as his running mate. Black women are even more important than Black men for the Democratic Party. They are very loyal Democratic voters, but at the same time, also very invisible in American politics. In the whole history of the United States, there's been only 2 Black women who made it to the Senate, so that's very limited. And Joe Biden is gonna announce his running mate anytime. I'll check my phone to see if it didn't go. No alerts, because it could have actually, he could announce it today or tomorrow. It's gonna be some time in the middle of this week, so we'll know that soon. And if you see a Black woman on his right side, basically as his most important campaign partner and potential vice president, then you can definitely see that as something that he has done that's created by the pressure of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is definitely a sign of how influential it has become. Both the fact that Biden is trying to use the movement, Trump is campaigning against it. We have to see how it plays out, but it's already, I think they have been very successful already in influencing American politics. And yeah, well, November 3rd, that's when we're supposed to know more. It will probably be a bit later because there is a lot of, well, the experts expect chaos at the polling stations because a lot of Americans will vote by mail, and that takes longer to count, so it could take a few days. Hopefully not longer, because that's not good for the American democracy, I would say. But we're gonna see that in November. Thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear if you have any questions.
Yes, first of all, thank you very, very much for the lecture. And also, I think it's very interesting to hear sort of on the ground perspective from you, obviously having joined the protests. But before we go into the Q&A, I would first of all like to sincerely apologize for the interruption that happened. I think at SIB, we usually deliberately try to keep our lectures and also our Zoom calls in this case as easily accessible to people as possible, because we want to be a platform to exchange knowledge and facilitate discussion. But I think we can all agree that what happened is absolutely intolerable and unacceptable. And yeah, my sincere apologies that it happened. And
thank you for solving it quickly. I think you did that. You took care of it very fast.
Yeah. Yeah, then also my apologies for everybody who had an honest interest in joining this lecture and wasn't able to afterwards and is only able to live stream right now, but we considered it necessary to lock the Zoom call. But yes, thank you very much for the lecture, and the floor is now open for questions and discussion. If you are in the Zoom call joining us, the way you ask a question is that you can click on participants at the bottom of your screen, and then in the bottom left corner of what pops up, there should be a raise hand button that you can click, and then I will call on you and you get to ask the question. And if you're watching via the live stream, feel free to just drop your questions in the comments, and then we'll pass them on here to the Zoom call. And yeah, let's start with Iris, Rose, or Jonte.
Oh yes, thank you very much for your lecture. I very much enjoyed it, and I think you've given a very thorough explanation of a lot of things that have been happening. And I was wondering if you think that if these movements benefits from being decentralized, or would it be useful for them to have a leader, or do you think it works very well that they only have small departments?
That's a very good question. I think it has been very successful for Black Lives Matter. When I walk around here in New York, sometimes I just ran into a random protest where some group of people is walking the streets or chanting at a square. And I think if you have one central leadership, it's impossible to create or very hard to create that kind of grassroots organizing where people take matters in their own hands and organize their own protests, which made it that made sure that the movement was able to grow so big. What could be a downside is that you also have a lot of different opinions within the movement. I noticed, for example, in Portland, where protests still are very strong and intense. There was an episode with federal police officers who were sent to Portland and misbehaved. There were some moms who took that as a sign that they would have to protect the protesters, and they created a wall of moms between the federal officers and the protesters. But I also noticed that they have been splitting up because there were two different opinions about how they should approach this. They got some attention for their wall of moms, and they kind of fell apart because they couldn't agree on the best approach. So that could be a downside, that you get splinter groups and you don't have a clear direction for the whole movement.
Thank you very much. So there are positive sides, but also might be some downsides. Then we'll continue with a question from James. 1 second, you might have to. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I was just wondering, as someone, you said you done a lot of work on gender in America. What would you say are the ways in which the violence against Black Americans differs based on gender? You know, because I'm not very familiar with that, so I want to.
Wait, could you repeat the what against Black Americans? Or the violence?
The violence, yes.
Based on gender. Well, I think there's a lot of, the focus is usually on Black men who don't survive the police encounter. Black women get forgotten a little bit. You may have heard about Brianna Taylor. That's a young woman in Kentucky who was sleeping in her own bed when police officers broke into, well, they thought there was something going on with drugs. They broke into the house to do a search, and her boyfriend was thinking they were intruders, so shot a gun. They shot back and Brianna died. And it turned out there was nothing related to drugs in that apartment. In that case, well, there is definitely a lot of activists trying to put her case also in front of all of us, but the police officers have not been charged with anything. And I think in general that sometimes we forget how Black women are also affected by this directly and also indirectly, because a lot of Black moms suffer seeing their children growing up with this violence. So they are also very active in the Black Lives Matter movement. It was actually started by Black women. And I think that women are definitely important carriers of that message.
Thank you very much. We have a question coming in from the live stream that reads, as a journalist, are you worried about how the media was treated during the protests? And for example, the CNN crew who was arrested. So does that concern you?
Yeah, that's definitely concerning. There were quite a lot of cases where journalists seemed to be even deliberately targeted, where they were showing their press badges and were still hit with rubber bullets, for example. And a CNN crew working in Minneapolis was arrested live on air, while it was very, very clear that they were media. And there were apologies from the state, and it was not the main story of the protest, I would say. But the fact that I had to get these goggles that you saw on Adrian in the first photo that I showed, I also have those goggles now. because as a journalist, you're not safe from tear gas or pepper spray, we've learned. And the freedom of the press in the United States is something, well, almost sacred, I would say, but is also very much under attack with a president that keeps telling Americans that the news is fake. And I would say that the behavior of security forces kind of fits in that pattern, and that's definitely very concerning.
All right. James, did you have another question, or is that just your hand still up?
Sorry, I didn't. I meant to put it down.
No,
Actually,
no worries.
I do have something if you need
Go
some.
ahead.
I guess the other, because I'm just very interested in how the violence manifests against different groups of people. Mm-hmm. Another one which I've heard a lot about is I know lots of LGBT people of color in America face a lot of just a different kind of violence, a different kind of discrimination. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, Black trans women, for example, are very vulnerable. I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but there have been way too many murders of Black trans women. So the Black Lives Matter movement, not specifically by the police, but they don't feel protected by the police as well. And the Black Lives Matter movement has been kind of expanding their message to specifically include LGBTQ people. There have been, I think there's some debate also within the movement about this intersectional approach where racial equality is connected to also sexual rights and the protection of sexual minorities. But overall, the Black Lives Matter movement is also very connected to feminism and to the message of protecting trans lives, for example. So here in New York, you would see a lot of leaflets and posters that say Black trans lives matter to specifically focus on that very vulnerable group.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. The next question comes from Bart.
Yes, thank you for your lecture. It was great. So my question is basically a lot of white people only start paying attention to violence against Black people when there has been excessive brutal violence against a person of color. And that is basically for a lot of white people the only way to their empathy. Do you think this is problematic?
Yes, if dying on the streets and having that filmed is the only way to get attention for inequality between Black and white Americans, I would say that's definitely problematic. And what I was telling you also about health inequalities, inequalities when it comes to wealth, there's a lot behind that violence that also needs to be addressed, I think, looking from a perspective of achieving a more fair American society where race doesn't create that huge gap in opportunities. But I would say that there is definitely more and more attention for all those other aspects of inequality between racial groups. Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans are also a group to consider. They also deal with high fatality rates in the pandemic, for example. but these economic aspects, health aspects are definitely also under under extra focus at this time.
Thank you. Then I have a question, because you told us a bit about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement that actually started quite some years ago. And I think, as we know, that racial inequalities are something that is happening not only in the US, but very much all over the world. So what would you say is different about the protests right now that it suddenly became such a more increased global movement? That you had the video of George Floyd being killed, and that sparking an extra wave of protests in very many countries instead of just the US.
Yeah, in the Netherlands as well, right? There has definitely, as far as I can see from here, more debate about racism. I think the Netherlands in general always gets very uncomfortable when race is discussed. Dutch people like to ignore and tell everyone that we're such an open and tolerant country. There is definitely some discussion possible about that. I think that the internet and social media had a big role in spreading that debate in the United States to countries like the Netherlands and other countries in Europe and all over the world, because we've all seen that video. It might, I would say, we could say that it's quite sad that the Netherlands needs a video from Minneapolis to discuss racial relations in the Netherlands. We should pay more attention maybe to our own struggles and listen to Dutch people of color who have something to say about it. We apparently started taking it serious when the US started this huge debate, and we copied that, but there is definitely also a domestic debate that should be had. But social media spreads everything really quickly, and we see that again now during these protests.
Thank you. We have a question that also treats the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement from the live stream. Do you think that the stances taken by big corporations, for example, the Redskin sponsors that pushed for a change in the name, will be something that actually will make a difference?
Yeah, that is to a certain extent questionable. I think it's true. A lot of big corporations kind of want to be part of the movement. Here in New York, you see Black Lives Matter all over in windows of stores and all over social media. Big corporations put it on their social media and make statements. That it's become a bit trendy to be part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I suspect that for these corporations, it's more of a marketing tool than that they actually have such a diverse and inclusive company. Because if you go look at the numbers about racial diversity in leadership in big corporations, I think there is definitely some improvement possible there. I don't think it will make a direct difference, but it does definitely. The fact that it is become such a trendy thing almost does also create some pressure, and it could help the movement over certain points to be very influential, and so it puts some extra power behind the movement, but in the corporations itself, I'm not sure that's actually going to change much.
All right, then let's give the floor to Bart again.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of Black people, or otherwise people of color, their stories are often trivialized when they're telling them, because they are not perceived as impartial narrators of their own stories because of their own identity or, well, yeah, social status as Black people or people of color. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true in general. I think that Black commentators, for example, in the media, are often seen as biased, as speaking from a biased viewpoint, and for white commentators, we hear that complaint a lot less. So there's definitely some truth in that, and I think that Black people in the US would say that they have to work harder to make themselves heard and to make themselves taken seriously also. It will be interesting to see how that also plays out if Joe Biden would nominate a Black woman as his running mate. You already see some hints of sexism and racial racism in the way that commentators and political analysts talk about the candidates for the position of running mate. A very influential Black congressman noticed that Kamala Harris and Karen Bass, both Black women, a senator and a congresswoman, who are their names are on the list for Joe Biden, and there's a lot of people comparing them. Kamala Harris is too ambitious. Karen Bass is more charming, and Susan Rice, another Black woman on that list, she's laughing, she's smiling more on TV, and this congressman pointed out that no one is comparing the white candidates on Joe Biden's list that way. So I think we may see some examples of how Black women have to fight harder to be heard and to be taken seriously if we see a Black woman next to Joe Biden on the ticket.
You have a personal guess of who's going to become his running mate?
A personal favorite or a list? What did you ask?
A guess.
A guess. I think Kamala Harris has very good chances. She's kind of the obvious choice, but maybe Joe Biden will surprise us. I wouldn't dare to predict.
All right, then we'll just wait for the news in the upcoming couple of days.
Yes, it will come soon, I think. It's getting late, so he has to tell us now.
I think Matthias has a question.
Thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. My question is related to a recent bit of news. Facebook has decided to ban depictions of Zwarte Piet and Jewish stereotypes on its platform, and I was wondering if you've got any opinions on that matter. And
yeah, just before this lecture started, I saw that. To be honest, I think that's a bit problematic, because it means that I'm all for trying. I would agree that Zwarte Piet is a racial stereotype, and that's not something that we should stick to as a Dutch society. But I'm not sure that Facebook, a company on the west coast of the United States, in California and Silicon Valley, that Facebook has to decide that for us. And I don't know, it may create extra backlash against that decision. And the debate in the Netherlands, well, if you're, I don't know how many of you are not from the Netherlands, but you'll probably get a taste of that quite ugly debate about Black Pete, a racist caricature that plays a role in December celebrations, in holiday traditions. But I think that Facebook, it's not a publication, it's It's almost like a utility that we all use. And I'm not sure if Facebook should decide for us if Zwarte Piet is okay or not, because the debate is ongoing in Dutch society, and I think Facebook is a platform where that is discussed and where we should be able to talk freely, even though it gets ugly sometimes.
Thank you for that opinion. Yeah, and then I think we can finish up with some last questions from the live stream. There's one from Mariame, and she asked, why do most Black Lives Matter supporters don't want police reform? Is the fact that the police are poorly trained not a concern to them?
Wait, that most Black Lives Matter don't want police reform? Well, that's not, most Americans don't want to abolish the police, but I think most Americans do want police reform. They just don't want to go as far as abolishing the whole police department and building a new kind of security institution. But police reform is not that controversial. A majority of Americans at this point actually agrees with like the general Black Lives Matter movement, and agrees that something should be done to stop police violence, but they look for smaller solutions like extra training or banning chokeholds, like some local governments have done. And that's actually something that's supported by a big part of the American population.
And the last question refers a bit to class. And somebody asks, what are the similarities or differences you've noticed in how the black working class Americans have been treated compared to white working class Americans?
That's a good question. And you all have very good questions. Because white working class Americans are also not in a great position. We should not pretend that only there's definitely a large extra layer and for Black Americans, but there's a lot of struggling white Americans too. And I think that also creates some racial tension, because those white working class Americans see Donald Trump as someone who fights for them. A lot of Black Americans feel that Donald Trump is racist and not listening to them. They both struggle with the growing gap between the rich and the poor in the United States. But still, if you look at the bigger picture, white families tend to be, on average, 10 times wealthier than Black families. And it's very hard for Black Americans to close that gap, because for similar jobs and with a similar degree, they still make less money, is what studies tell us. So even though there is definitely a group of white Americans who need help, they on average are still in a better position than Black Americans.
Okay. Then if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank you once again very much for answering all these diverse questions, and also to everybody who asked a question and contributed to the discussion. Thank you very much. I think that was very interesting. Yes.
Thank you for having me. And nice to hear from all of you what you're interested in, and good questions to get a little bit deeper into the topic.
Awesome. Yeah, then I'd say the lecture part of tonight comes to an end. Feel very free to join us for our interactive bingo that we have coming up now. Also, if you're currently watching the live stream and would like to be admitted, to the Zoom call for the bingo again. We will find a way to make that work. And if you're interested in more activities that we are hosting, since it is Kai Week, we have a couple coming up. Tomorrow for Kai participants, if you are registered for the week, we have an interview with Teun van de Keuken. He is a TV producer and journalist and has founded the Fairtrade chocolate brand Tony Chocolonely that you might be familiar with. So you'll be able to ask him your own questions also via the Kai platform and the Kai app. And that will be followed by our disputing games. Then on Thursday, we'll have an open air lecture in Noorderplantsoen, the park here in Groningen, about sexual and reproductive health rights in Uganda with Dr. Billy de Haas from the University of Groningen. And on Friday, you'll be back able to join us online again for a lecture on the Interparliamentary Alliance on China and how they would advise to respond to an increasingly prominent and aggressive China on the international plane. And after that lecture, we will be playing online escape rooms. That is also a free social activity, but you do have to sign up for that, and you can do that via the Facebook or our website. So once again, thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you around.